And I'm sitting there, and at the end of all of that, I said, well, John, everybody comes out well on this except me. And you looked back at me and said, yeah, Dad, you lose every time. and I sat there and thought, yeah, probably right. And you drove your new 4Runner to college a month later or something. But, it's negotiation. That's what we do. And we can't always please each other. But I think it's how we get through the day. And it's appropriate that we use the very same principle. What's driving you? What's motivating you? What's below the line? Yeah, we can probably work this out. Now,
welcome to Negotiation Made Simple, where we help you master the art of negotiation and win the next deal. I'm your host, John Lowry. This is a really exciting day on the podcast. Today is release day, where my new book, Negotiation Made Simple, is now available in bookstores, on Amazon. I hope that you will go pick it up. And today we have a really special episode, because today what I wanted to do was to really give you all a sense of the heart around this book and the inspiration for this book, which really came from my father, Randy Lowry. And you'll notice as you buy the book that I've dedicated the book to him. And I'm thrilled today that we get to have a conversation about leadership and conflict and creating peace in the world and how it is that we can use negotiation to do that. And in this episode, he will give some great practical ideas for how to be a better leader, how to be a better problem solver, and even how to be a better parent. Let's jump into this conversation with my dad, Dr. Randy Lowry. So the dedication of Negotiation Made Simple is actually dedicated to you. And I write to my dad, Randy Lowry, who taught so many, including me, how to negotiate effectively, efficiently, and respectfully. So that's been a quote that you have used for countless years. I've heard you say it probably 1,000,000 times, but talk a little bit about that particular quote and why that statement is how you end every negotiation program that you do.
Well, that's actually the end of a longer statement. So let me kind of pull the whole thing out and share it. It's a statement that essentially says peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the ability to deal with conflict effectively, efficiently, and respectfully. And in a sense, negotiation is all about creating peace. It's creating peace because there's already conflict and we need to work our way through it. Or it's creating peace because we're on opposite sides of a deal we both want. And we want that deal. We want the peace that comes with the success of making the deal. And so how's that done? And my sense is that there is an effectiveness that needs to happen. There's an efficiency. We can't go on forever. And perhaps most profound, there's a respect. And when negotiators respect each other, when people who are in conflict even have enough respect for each other, they can get a deal, they're well served.
So I'm really excited about this morning, and there's lots of different ways that I want to go in this conversation. But let's start right there with the respectfully part of this quote and the respect that you just talked about, and help us think a little bit and understand about how treating people really well is actually really, really good in getting what you want out of a negotiation.
I remember my mentor in life, a college president, said one time, you don't have to like the people you work with to be effective and to be successful, but you do have to have some level of mutual respect. And I think that's true. I think there is some level that says, even if I disagree with you, even if I'm on the opposite side of a tough moment, if I can respect you as a negotiator, respect you as an advocate on the other side, respect you as having a perspective, perhaps not mine, but if I can do those things, we then have the possibility of sitting down and putting a deal together. When respect is completely gone, then it seems like it's really hard to find that resource that allows us to even sit together.
And especially today when, we see so much disrespect out there, especially on social media and even in the media, it creates an environment where it's really difficult to be productive in conflict. Let's talk about conflict a little bit, because that's been the place where you have done most of your negotiating, whether it's as a party working through conflict or representing a party working through conflict. But you've also been in the seat of a mediator for years and years and years. And so for people that are in the midst of conflict and they're trying to think about how to work through it, here comes this idea of negotiation. And how is it that they can use the skill of negotiation to get through whatever problem plagues them today?
Well, as you well know, there's a continuum of options when we have something we need to work on, either a conflict or a deal we want to put together. And if you think about conflict more for a moment, that option goes all the way from, some kind of very, very informal conversation to violence on the other end. Well, in the middle are some things that are more productive than doing nothing and much more productive than violence. It's this communication process we use. We call it negotiation. It's a communication process to see if we can't find where there are interests that in fact come together and creative options that can be discovered so that we can get a deal. Mediation is really nothing more than facilitated negotiation. Imagine a table and the two negotiators on opposite sides of the table. Sometimes they can do it alone, but sometimes they need help. And so the mediator, either literally or symbolically, sits at the end of the table and facilitates the negotiation, sometimes in a way that the people themselves can't do it.
So one of your famous lines is this idea of going below the line. Tell us what going below the line is all about.
Well, if we think about two people needing to negotiate a deal, often they come together with two different perspectives of that deal, or in the language we most often use, there's an issue and they have two different positions on the resolution of that issue. At times, they can work through that. They can each compromise and find a place where they can say, there's a deal, we can live with that. But at times, they can't. And what often happens then is they become committed to those positions. They think the only way they can convince the other side is to escalate their conversation or their behavior. And pretty soon, we're no longer negotiating. Well, if you would imagine a piece of paper and those two words, position, on opposite sides, draw a line underneath that, that's where this illustration comes from. The idea is going behind the positions, going to the place where they originated, trying to figure out why people took them. And so I would say go below the line, and below the line are things that we call interests. Psychologists or others might talk about needs, but they're those things that drive us, those things that cause us to take the position. They're very, very real. And because they're very real and they motivate us, they're going to have to be satisfied. And the grand difference between working above the line, arguing these positions, and working below the line, trying to understand the needs and the interests, is the creativity that might come. Because above the line, I'm trying to convince you of my concrete position. You're trying to do the same. Below the line, though, we're talking about what you need and how that can be satisfied. And many times I can satisfy your needs, and you then can also satisfy mine.
So what are some examples of things below the line? Like what is driving people to take these positions?
Well, if you listen to the media and what sells, I was listening to the major national radio reports this morning, satellite radio, and, conflict sells. Differences are exciting to us. You don't have many news shows that end up with people solving problems. And they don't end up with people solving problems because that's not what's exciting. What's exciting is the fight, the fuss, to see how people can get invested in their differences. Well, that's fine for television and it's fine for entertainment. Doesn't work so well in life. And whether it's a legislative body and people walking out their positions, trying to figure out how to have influence, or it's countries at war with each other, the same stuff's going on. They've taken positions, they're escalating those positions, and yet there are some real needs that could be met if they were able to find a process to do it. Perhaps one good example politically would be President Jimmy Carter and the Camp David Accords. And here you had Israel and Egypt arguing over the Sinai Desert, and they'd fought wars over it, a number of them. And finally, here's this U.S. president, Jimmy Carter, who some wouldn't think was all that effective as a president, but he was effective during 13 days at Camp David, Maryland. And as he brought Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin together, these two warriors from their respective countries, he didn't argue about, who should get the Sinai Desert. What he began to understand and search for is what was motivating them. And I'm making this much simpler than it was, but essentially, Israel wanted a sense of security, and Egypt wanted a sense of protecting its sovereignty, and he was able to craft a deal out of understanding the interests that, frankly, even though the Middle East is a mess, that peace has lasted for decades. And so that's true whether we're talking about international peace or we're talking about two people in an organization that are having trouble getting along, or we're talking even about a family or a community. We talk in terms of positions, but we need to live our life in terms of our interests and recognizing that as we satisfy someone else's interest, they may very well be able to satisfy ours.
Let's jump to another context because I love this idea of going below the line. And you've demonstrated through that story how this can be powerful in bringing peace and even an area as complex and as difficult as the Middle East or Israel. But let's bring it back here and into the world that a lot of people find themselves in, and that's just working in an organization or working in a company and all of the conflict that exists there. And so let's jump into a particular example, and I'd love to just get you to apply this to that and provide some thinking in terms of where to go. So let's assume, for example, at Thrivance, we have the opportunity to work with a lot of companies that have challenges amongst their executive teams, and sometimes the executive teams and the boards and all of that kind of stuff. And so if you're working with a company, and let's assume that this is a company that has grown very quickly, it started as a family business, and now it's at that moment where it's time to pass it to the next generation. A lot of companies find themselves in that place, and that moment can be a very sticky and difficult moment because you have lots of employees that are now part of it, and so it's not just the family that's involved. You got other people. Many times you have a founder, and the founder has built this company on a certain set of values and a certain set of expectations and a vision that has worked really, really well. But the founder is getting tired, but the founder won't let go. And you have the next generation that's ready to take it to different places and different levels. And in the midst of all of that, there's a whole lot of conflict. Like, what do you say in a moment like this? How do you apply this go below the line approach to a moment like that in the history of a company or organization?
Well, your illustration is something that we could find on almost every corner.
Sure.
It's not just one particular company like we'll talk about perhaps in terms of the illustration, but it's companies all over. It's organizations all over. It's churches all over. It's nonprofits all over. Mm-hmm. So this sense that you describe where we have one generation that invested and created it and another generation now that needs to take it over, and yet they see life differently. And because they see life differently, it's likely they take on a particular issue two different positions. And when they take those positions, they can escalate that conflict, or one can step back and say, why are they taking them? And so let me just play with that for a moment. Let's assume that a nonprofit or a business organization or even a church, that we have those two folks, founder, and then we have next generation, and they're thinking about how do we serve people best? Well, it's likely they have different views of that because they did it or are doing it in very different times. And just take for a moment that, I'm stereotyping, but that the older person is more traditional in an approach, and the younger person is more innovative and creative in approach. Maybe even in the years in between, technology has emerged that never existed before. And so here they are saying, this is how we should take care of people, and yet their solutions are different. I would say, instead of arguing about that, and if I was the mediator, I'd take each side away alone, and I'd say, help me understand. What are you trying to achieve? And I bet you that I would hear essentially the same thing. Well, I'm trying to take care of my customers or my clients or my parishioners. Well, I am too. That in fact, the interest is in common, even though the approach or tactic is very different. And so when I found that those interests were in common, I would say, okay, let's think about let's brainstorm, if you will. Let's finally get creative and say, how can we meet those? Now, obviously, in there somewhere, there's a little bit of give on each side. Perhaps technology doesn't come completely in instantly, but perhaps I don't stay doing it the way I used to do it without technology forever either. So there's some give and take in there, but they share a common interest. And they share even a larger interest, and that is to make the organization effective at what it's doing, to have the nonprofit carry out its mission, to have the business make money. And so they share plenty if we can get below the line with that conversation as opposed to above the line.
Okay, another real-world challenge that I want to present to you, because this is really good stuff and I think helpful for people. One of the other sources of conflict that businesses are facing today on a wide scale is the hybrid work environment. And
Sure.
You have people that
we're actually in an office today, aren't we?
We are in an office. We're like the only ones in the office, though. So in this world where COVID launched us into this different kind of working environment, you have this challenge to where the expectation is, and it's documented all over the place. All the research would say, if you make people come back, you're going to have problems because folks don't want to come back 5 days a week sitting at their desk the way that it used to be. But at the same time, you've got managers that say, yes, but productivity has to remain. In fact, productivity needs to continue to improve. And so as we look at productivity, we've got to make sure that we're seeing what we need to be seeing there, even though we want to provide the flexibility that we provide. And so in a moment like that, if you're a manager, how is it that you work through that conflict in terms of having your folks perform at the level they need to perform, but giving them the flexibility that they need so you can actually retain them on your team?
Well, I can't talk about it in relationship to every corporation in America.
Sure.
But what I do see is interesting. You'll see an article in the paper that'll say, whatever the corporation name is, has ordered its people back to work. And as of the first of next month, everybody is going to have to be in the office. And then you have in the same article, the people saying, I don't want to do that. I'm not going to do it. I'll quit if I have to, blah, blah, blah. Well, they're dealing with exactly what we're talking about. The issue of whether employees have to come back to work. One takes a position yes, one takes a position no, and there's conflict.
Sure.
What you've not seen much of, and maybe it goes on, but I think it probably doesn't, you haven't seen much in terms of a corporation that says, we've got a challenge here. We have some corporate values or corporate interests that need to be met, and we're having trouble meeting them because our employee workforce isn't here. What would it be like if, perhaps with a mediator, management and employees sat down and said, let's talk about this? Because they each have legitimate interests. It's not that they're trying to mess each other up. They both want the corporation to work. But what if they talk to each other? And management said, we're going to get together. We're going to spend the next 3 months. We're going to be in conversations, deep conversations, to see if there aren't some more creative ways to satisfy the interest of employees as we satisfy the interest of the corporation. I may be naive, but I'm optimistic enough to think if you have the right conversation, you probably can come up with some really creative answers. Because I think the corporation has some legitimate interest it would like to achieve that can't be achieved if nobody ever shows up. But the people who are not showing up, they're meeting some goals or needs that perhaps couldn't have been met in the old work world. And so if we shared those, if we talked about those, there are probably ways to work them out. I think it's interesting that we are suspicious of each other. You want me back just because you want to control me. Oh, you want to stay away just so I can't know what you're really doing. Well, yeah, there's a lot of suspicion there. But again, we both have values to support an enterprise that's supporting both of us. So let's recognize that and be a lot more creative.
So that's a great segue into thinking about negotiation and leadership. And in addition to all of the work that you've done in the negotiation and mediation field, you also spent 16 years as a college president, as you've had a number of other leadership positions kind of in the community and so forth. And so talk a little bit about how your ability to negotiate has made you a better leader and how negotiation is a critical leadership skill.
Well, I think negotiation, as you so artfully say in your new book, it's a life skill. This is how we live. We live by communicating with each other, putting deals together all day long, whether you're doing that with a 2-year-old child to get them to eat their Cheerios, or you're doing it with a 80-year-old grandparent to get them to have the medical care. Wherever we are on the spectrum, we're getting through life by using a communication process to put these little deals together, perhaps dozens every day. And so it is not only a part of life, but it's certainly a part of leadership. And we don't often label it that way. We don't often nail it that way. But I do think that we got through 16 years of being a college president, and the average is a little under 6. So I think we checked the box in a context where there is some conflict at times. 300 or 400 faculty, 6,000 students, 12,000 parents. I mean, there's no way you can please everybody all day, every day. And yet you also can't go to war. You can't use violence. You're going to have to find some way that we can take those issues that come up and work through them appropriately. And I felt like I was advantaged because my field was negotiation, mediation, and that could be applied in that circumstance. I think managers are negotiators. They may not have that on their card. They may not think of themselves that way, but they spend all day long dealing with conflict, and most effectively if they have that set of skills. There was one study that suggested, managers spend about 25 to 40% of their time dealing with conflict. Well, those are moments that somebody else couldn't resolve. They're moments that escalated up to the management level. You better have a set of skills that can help you do it, and they're in the book you just wrote.
So as we think about negotiation and leadership a bit further, one of the things that I always find is that really good leaders, they not only have a vision, but they also understand and realize that while they're managing a P&L, while they're managing a business, while they may be responsible for generating a certain amount of revenue, they understand that their world or their business is people oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And negotiation, one of the interesting things about it is, regardless of who you're representing and who ultimately will be a party to the contract or the settlement agreement or whatever it is, it's always a process between people. And so talk a little bit about just the psychological dimension and how that comes into negotiation and how you use that as a mediator trying to resolve conflict or trying to put a deal together to kind of move an organization forward.
Well, I think you're right. It is all about people. That's both the advantage and the disadvantage. But it's all about people. And I think we have to step back and say, how are people most profoundly influenced? Now, I think there was a time, and there are still organizations, that people are influenced by the hierarchy or by the power that's very clear power that's walked out. And, I think in a sense, the military works off of that model, and probably with good reason, because you can't have 5,000 sailors on an aircraft carrier and all negotiate about what we're going to do next. Not going to work. So power, hierarchy makes all kinds of sense. But that's an exceptional kind of organization. In most organizations, we're dealing with a lot of people, and the idea or the challenge is to get them to all march in the same direction toward these corporate goals in terms of service, profit, whatever they might be. And that's going to happen, I think, in today's world. It's more likely with influence that will be more collaborative, more focused on communication, more understanding interest. That's just going to move that organization forward. I think back in my time as a university president, and I counted one time, we had 128 board meetings during my 16 years. That's a lot of board meetings.
A lot of meetings.
And those could be fairly adversarial moments if one isn't really careful. My sense was you negotiate the hard stuff before the meeting happens, and you treat people well, and you work through it so that when you have the meeting, it's not just show and tell, but when you have the meeting, you've done the really hard work with people so that the meeting goes well. And there are lots of studies that suggest I'm much more likely to walk out my side of something if I've been a part of the discussion to get there than if you tell me or order me what to do. And so it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort. Some managers would say, boy, that's really inefficient. Why should I spend that much time listening to you? And my question would be, well, what's going to happen if you don't? And how much time are you going to spend on the back end of not having invested right on the front end?
That's some great counsel. So you spent a lifetime negotiating, mediating. What's your favorite story that you like to tell about a moment of negotiation or a moment of conflict resolution?
Well, there are lots and lots of stories. Most of them would take way too long to tell, but let me try to abbreviate this one. I was invited to mediate a case with a woman who had worked for a corporation for many years. And the corporation, for some reason, went in and laid off a number of older women. Lawyers picked up on that, filed a lawsuit. And so now we're walking into the hotel room with lawyers on all sides of the table, the business people, the woman. And the lawyers did a great job of what lawyers do. They argued for the first hour or two from their positions as to who was at fault. But then I, as the mediator, got to ask the woman some questions. And in front of everybody, I asked her a question. I never knew the answer before I asked it, but I said, tell me, what do you want out of this case? And she could have said, I want $1 billion in the company to go bankrupt. But she didn't say that. She said, I could almost not understand her. She said, under her voice, she said, all I want is what I would have had. And I said, well, what's that? And this took a lot longer than my story, but she eventually said, well, I need my medical benefits. And I said, well, why do you need your medical benefits? And she said, well, if you understood my situation, you'd know. Well, everybody listening could ask the next question, right? What's your situation? She said, well, I'm the sole support of my son who has polio, and I'm the sole support of my daughter who has MS, and I'm the sole support of my husband who has cancer. I really need those medical benefits. And at that moment, we understood what was below the line. At that moment, we understood what this case was about. And at that moment, it was pretty clear if there was some creative way to take care of the medical benefits, that's what she's seeking. And, after several hours, we put the deal together, and essentially the vice president of the company came in and said, this may surprise you, but we want to rehire you. And we want to rehire you because in doing so, we can give you those medical benefits. It costs almost nothing. And we're going to rehire you until you retire in a couple of years. And they went on and gave her those things that would kind of put her life back together. But then they said something that no court in the country could give her. They said, if you want to stay home and not come back to work, that's okay with us. You need to stay home and take care of your husband.
Wow.
And her settlement was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She avoided a trial and litigation. Lawyers avoided the risk of all that. And well-meaning people that worked well for a few hours around the table put that deal together. I know people will listen to something like that and say, oh, that's just so touchy-feely, and that couldn't really happen in real life. No, it does happen in real life. As a mediator, 60 to 80% of the time, I find out what's driving people lawyers have never even discovered. And when we find that below-the-line information, we have a pretty good chance then to be more creative and resolve it.
So there's that element of people are people. And if you can find out what's driving people, you can go a long way in terms of getting what you want, but then also being able to provide people with what they want as well.
And I imagine you have a chapter or two in the book.
There is a couple of chapters about that, yes.
that gives us a roadmap on how to do that. It's not very complicated. You ask questions, you listen. People will tell you what's driving them, and then you have the advantage of being able to use that.
Yeah, so in the book, we talk about being empathetic. And empathy and negotiation, they haven't been tightly associated as ideas, but there is a lot of empathy that needs to go on, a lot of empathy that happened in the story that you just told. But then once you have that understanding, you have to do something with it. And so there's another chapter in the book called The Roadmap to Resolution, which is what you do with that information once you have it. So let's get real.
Let me just pause there.
Yeah.
I think that chapter on empathy, I've never seen that in a negotiation book, and I've read a couple, but I've never seen that, and I think that's a powerful addition to this field that's developed over the last 20 or 30 years, and some people, crass business people or obnoxious lawyers can dismiss that. But they're dismissing the aspect of humanness that is often there. And they would be better off to embrace it, just like your chapter would suggest, because ironically, it makes them more powerful. If I understand you and what drives you, that is not just some kind of social psych kind of exercise. That's getting information that actually makes me more powerful. Because when I get it and I can satisfy your needs, I come a lot closer to getting mine.
That's great stuff. As we wrap this up, let's get real. So one of the interesting things, I don't get this with many guests, but one of the interesting things is that you and I have had the opportunity to negotiate a lot.
Well, this will be getting real. Go ahead, John.
Yes. So we've done that professionally working together, but we've also done it as father and son. And I think one of the things that is a reflection of really good negotiation is a healthy relationship. And negotiation really is the tool that allows relationships to kind of thrive. And so we've had to spend a lot of time negotiating. I remember things back in high school and college and just all that stuff. I'm sure it started long before that. But you do have some advice in terms of parents that you've shared with me now that I'm a parent about how to negotiate with kids and how important that is in terms of raising kids and developing the kind of relationships with kids that are really important. So share some advice for parents, new parents like Adam, who's getting ready to have kids. The kids know how to negotiate somehow straight out of the womb, so you better get ready as a parent.
Oh, I think they do, and they can't use language like we use, but they can throw a tantrum in a store, and in a sense, they're raising the stakes and escalating it, but they're negotiating, right? I want attention. Are you going to give me attention? If you don't give me attention, I'll escalate this until you will give me attention. We've had a lifetime of negotiation, I think. And I do think there's a moment there where the negotiation becomes pretty significant. I don't know if it's junior high or high school or something, but somewhere in there, you can't use other forms of modifying somebody's behavior. You're almost adultish, and we're going to talk this one through. And at times it's hard because a parent and a child have positions that are different, and there is emotion that gets involved in that. I remember a time where I don't remember exactly the moment, but you came to me and decided that I should buy you a new car. And it was an interesting series of events. You were going away to college. It was up north. There was a lot of snow. The car you had wouldn't work. And so I needed to do this, and I could get you this car, then trade this car, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm sitting there, and at the end of all of that, I said, well, John, everybody comes out well on this except me. And you looked back at me and said, yeah, Dad, you lose every time. and I sat there and thought, yeah, probably right. And you drove your new 4Runner to college a month later or something. But, it's negotiation. That's what we do. And we can't always please each other. But I think it's how we get through the day. And it's appropriate that we use the very same principle. What's driving you? What's motivating you? What's below the line? Yeah, we can probably work this out. Now, there will be times where I think a parent has to be a parent. And you now have discovered, with 3 children, those times as well. And no matter how much you would like to say yes to everything, there are times we say, I've got more experience, I've got a broader perspective. This is just not something that we can get to. And so that's important, but I think that's a minority of the moments.
Well, I've got 2 teenagers, so whatever pain or cost I inflicted, they are certainly being returned by Weston and Brooklyn as we negotiate through their teenage years.
Keeps you on your toes.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Lowry, Dad, this has been awesome. Thanks so much for spending some time on the Negotiation Made Simple podcast as we launch this new book. Now, I wrote this book, but the next book is the book that you need to write on conflict management, and the world needs that book. And so here's my public challenge to go and to write that book. Spend some of those retirement years getting up early and writing. You'll actually love it. It's a great, great exercise.
And I guess that's the beginning of another negotiation.
There you go.
Great job on the book. Bless you, son.
Wow, what an incredible conversation with my father, Dr. Randy Lowry. It's been so special having him on the Negotiation Made Simple podcast. I love what he said about the importance of the people elements around negotiation. Take with you that idea that he shared about going below the line, about understanding the interests that drive people to take positions. It's stuff like that that can make all the difference in terms of dealing with that problem employee or trying to get that business deal done, or even going home and being a better parent and building the relationships with your teenager. That is outstanding advice. And it's just been incredible to have Dr. Lowry here on the show on this very special day where my new book, Negotiation Made Simple, is being released worldwide. I hope you'll go and pick it up. It's in bookstores, or you can jump on Amazon or wherever you buy books. And in this book, Negotiation Made Simple, you will get a very simple, practical framework in which you can place every negotiation. And as a result of that, you can get more of what you want in life. Thank you for listening to the Negotiation Made Simple podcast. We'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode.